Welcome to the Bamboo Parenting Podcast. My name is Kayla. I'm a psychology researcher.
And I'm Leah, a practicing psychologist.
And we're joining you today on beautiful Bindal and Woogarugaba country in Queensland, Australia. We interview experts on self-care, infant care, and relationships. In this episode, we talk to Dr. Lauren Breen, Professor of Psychology at Curtin University in Perth, Australia. Lauren is a TEDx speaker who is passionate about translating her research on dying, death, and bereavement into policy and practice.
In this episode, Kayla and Amanda explore the multifaceted dimensions of loss. They delve into the physical, cognitive, and emotional impacts experienced by individuals grappling with grief. From understanding how children process loss to navigating the complexities of perinatal loss and explaining death to young ones. They also discuss the journey of pregnancy after perinatal loss and offer insight into supporting those who are navigating the challenging terrain of grief. Join them as they navigate these profound themes with empathy and understanding. We hope you enjoy.
Hi, Lauren. It's really great to have you on the podcast today. I'm very excited to learn more about your research. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well, thank you. And it's so lovely to be part of this. Thank you.
Great. I'm joined by Amanda today as my co-host. And we'll just start off by broadly, what can you tell us? What is grief and what are some of the impacts? So perhaps starting with some of the physical and cognitive impacts when people experience a loss.
Yeah, so grief is our response to loss, and it can be a response to a death loss or a non-death loss. If someone dies, obviously you'll experience loss from that death, but a non-death loss could be when you lose a job and you lose that sense of identity that job gave you. So there's a raft of non-death losses as well that can be related to a death loss or that we experience irrespective of whether there's a death loss there. So grief is our response to this, and it's very multidimensional. And by that, what I mean is a lot of people think of grief as being primarily an emotional kind of response. And certainly lots of emotions are involved. Grief itself is not a single emotion, but we might experience sadness and anger and guilt and relief and a raft of things. But it also can affect us in terms of our thoughts and our behaviors, our social connections, all kinds of aspects of our life. So in terms of some of I think you said physical and cognitive impacts. So a lot of people who are grieving will talk about how they might experience changes in their eating habits and their sleeping habits, physically feeling pain. So they might say, I physically feel pain in my chest or in my tummy. And it can have lots of cognitive impacts. So a lot of people will say, I'm struggling to concentrate. My memory is a mess right now. Feel like I'm living in cotton wool. I can't do the same kinds of things that I used to be able to do really quickly. Yeah, so it has lots of those kinds of impacts.
You did touch on it, but what about some of those familial and social relationships, the impacts on that?
Absolutely, it does have that impact. So for some people, it can bring their relationships closer, but not always. We know that a lot of people say that their family and friends are the number one source of support for them in any kind of loss. But we also know that when we ask people what isn't helpful, the number one is also family and friends. So, it's very easy, I think, for us to be tempted to engage in cliches and platitudes and, it's all good. She had a good innings, or don't worry, you can try again, or those kinds of things, which comes usually from a place of support. It's just not necessarily interpreted as supportive. And it's because when we're talking about issues of death and grief, these things are not things that we find necessarily very comfortable to talk about. So straight away, we can have our family and friends, for example, feeling really uncomfortable. Oh my goodness, I'm going to see them on the weekend. What am I going to say to them? I know they just experienced this awful thing. What can I possibly do? This is really awful and yuck. So they might say nothing at all and act like everything's fine. And then that obviously is hurtful. Or they might say something, but they're trying to relieve the pain and the discomfort, but end up saying something that is a cliche or a platitude or something that's not necessarily helpful.
That's really interesting, and I definitely understand the sort of desire to balance being there in a very supportive way, but not being there in a cliche way or wanting to make things worse. So, what do you think people can do, friends and family? What's the best way that they can support other people who are experiencing grief and loss?
It's really interesting, actually, that you just said the phrase being there, because so often that's what people say. The people who were helpful were people who were just being there for me, who were just there for me. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that people have to necessarily say or do anything, but just being with and walking alongside with, that we don't have to try and remove that person's distress. There's nothing that can be said that's just going to fix the problem. So it's okay to say, look, I don't know what to say, but I'm here for you. And then sometimes, of course, we try and offer something. So we might say, oh, let me know if you need anything, which is better than ignoring the situation completely or running away from people. But it also puts the onus on the grieving person to recognize, well, what is it that I need? Oh, I need this. Okay, well, who can I ask for that? Oh, but I don't want to bother them. So, in fact, it's better in a way to actually offer something in a really practical way and say, I'm doing a big cook up on the weekend. Would it be helpful if I drop a casserole off to you on Sunday afternoon? Or would it be helpful if, I'm picking the kids up from after sports training on Thursday? Do you want me to do that for you for the next few weeks? Or whatever it might be, but a really specific, practical offer. And then that person can say yes or no. And that can be sometimes a lot more supportive than just, oh, let me know when you need anything, because people tend not to actually follow up on that. They just think, oh, I'll just keep it to myself, or I don't even know what I need because my life has just gone kaboom.
I love that. I think that makes so much sense. And I feel like then you're not going to end up with 30 casseroles all at the same time, which is what you see in the movies and on TV of what happens. But I think just giving somebody the option to say yes or no to some really just practical, helpful things would be awesome. And then I think also sets you up on a path, I suppose, for then that person feeling comfortable for then asking for more support, perhaps.
Yeah, and gives the grieving person some control when their life possibly feels like everything is out of control. So at least I can have some control and say over, yes, I would love that. Or actually, I don't need another casserole right now. But what might actually be helpful is this. So you can actually have that conversation.
And I guess as well being mindful of there is no end point to grief. This is something that they will just live with the rest of their lives. So as you said, the 30 casseroles, that's in the first couple of weeks right around the funeral, but being really mindful that you can provide support for weeks, months, and into years, if you have a close relationship with that person.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of grieving people say everyone was really great early on, but then it was maybe a couple of months later that everything just stopped. And that's when I really fell in a hole. And that's when there wasn't anyone there for me, and I felt like everyone just was going back to normal. And all of a sudden, I realized, oh, and that's when the darker times can actually happen, is sometime after. So yeah, like you said, you could do little things to check in with a person. You might know, for example, of a date that's an anniversary date of, a death, for example, or the person's birthday. So that might be when you just text and say, thinking of you and the family today, or just any kind of thing like that. People like to know that they're still being thought of, or that the person who has died is still being thought of as well.
Yeah. I also really liked when you were talking about grief is not only in response to death. We can grieve a lot of things, and thinking about children, especially where those might seem like relatively minor things to an adult, but that is still real grief for children. And I thought of my sister who is adopted, and my mom is in a relationship with another female. So she doesn't have a father figure. And when she was about maybe 7 or 8 years old, she really wanted to make a Father's Day card. Everyone in her class was making Father's Day cards. And my mum was really great about it, and they did it. So even though that wasn't a death, she was grieving the loss of the relationship with her biological parents that she would never have. And just implementing those memorialization and ways to connect, I think was a really great way that they did that through, arts and crafts. And there's been little things throughout her life where she's try to have that connection. So I think just being really mindful, especially with children, that there's many things that they could be grieving, and not just, the loss of a grandparent or a big figure within their lives. It could be something more nuanced than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do try, when I do webinars or seminars or talks to various groups of people, is to try and get that point across, that for a long time we maybe always thought about it in relation to a death loss, but it's much, much broader than that. And I think that's one thing that the pandemic showed us, because people obviously experienced a ton of different losses when they lost jobs, for example, or the loss of routine, or the loss of independence, or the loss of things that they considered to just be normal and that everyone did, like, going to the school ball or going to a graduation ceremony, or people have been much more aware of those non-death losses, I think, in the past few years, and we've lived through them and with them as well.
Lauren, is there a difference between normal grief and a more pathological style of grief?
So yes. So it's very important to note that grief itself is not at all a mental health issue. It's normal, it's natural. We all experience grief multiple times in our life, multiple times in a day, all for in relation to all kinds of different things. It's been a little bit of a controversial concept, I think, for a little while. But yes, so we now have in our diagnostic manuals now acknowledge or now list a condition called prolonged grief disorder. So this is a condition where the loss can be have such an impact on them that their experience of that is so intense and so unremitting, in that it persists over such a long period of time, and that they're not able to invest any of their time or energy into their daily tasks or things that they would otherwise want to do. So whether that's relationships or work or looking after themselves or looking after other people.
And then what sort of supports would be good for someone who maybe feels that they are at risk of having that prolonged disorder?
So there are excellent psychological therapies available for people with prolonged grief disorder. The issue is that people who might meet the criteria for that, or whose grief is like that, are actually less likely to seek support. So they might not be on any health professional's radar, for example. So a lot of people might think that antidepressants are really good for grief. And we know that they're actually not particularly good for grief. They might be great for other things, for example, depression, but grief is not the same as depression. So, there's lots of things where the treatments or the access, getting people to the right things are actually very challenging.
And I think that leads in well to maybe a discussion around what are normal behaviors around that period, normal responses to grief. And obviously they are some gender differences, and also for children. So maybe you could touch on, what should we expect from our loved ones if they are experiencing a loss?
Yeah, grief affects us and all aspects of our life. So we might feel more emotional. We might be more prone to being teary. We might, even people say they sigh a lot more. They're feeling more lethargic, they're more tired, they might sleep more, they might sleep less, they might experience physical pain, they might experience changes in memory and concentration, and make more mistakes at work, for example, or feel that they're more forgetful, not like as much noise, not want to go out and have fun. Maybe they want to go out and have fun as a way to distract themselves from what's going on. So there's a whole raft of different kinds of things that are completely normal. We usually talk about people, I guess, oscillating or vacillating between focusing on the loss and focusing on restorative actions. So if someone is only focusing on the loss, they're not able to put time and effort and energy in other things in life. And so it's very important, I think, to do both. So it's perfectly normal to have a little cry in the day, or to hear a piece of music that reminds you of that person or that thing that's gone, and for that to, upset you. But then there might be something else that happens, and you remember something funny that they did, or whatever it might be, and or you realize, oh, I better go pay that bill I need to do, or get to work, and so you're constantly, we all live with grief, and some people much more than others. But it's about how we, are we still able to invest our time and our energy in other things? And that might not be something that, day one we're doing, but over time we might be able to more readily be able to invest in those kinds of, I'm going to go up and I'm going to, look after someone today. I'm going to go for a walk today. I'm going to start a new hobby today, or whatever it might be. You also mentioned gender differences and differences, I guess, across the lifespan, particularly between children. There are some gender differences, and we know that in general, we might say that women are more likely to be more intuitive in their grief and more emotional. But we also know that it's more socially acceptable for women to behave in that way. So, if I was in a meeting or I was out in public, at a social event, and I was a bit teary, I probably wouldn't make people feel quite as uncomfortable than if a man was acting in that same way. I mean, why is that the way it is? But it is. So, and it's quite interesting, actually. There were some researchers who interviewed some mothers who'd been perinatally bereaved, and asked them to describe their grief, and then asked them to describe their husband's grief. And when they were describing their own grief, they provide all this rich detail and, a lot of description and so on, and not so much about their husband's grief. And so the researchers, of course, interpreted this or concluded that, men only grieve for a short time. They're not very emotional in their grief. They're not as attached to their baby as their wives were. But there's a problem in their study design there, in that they only asked the women. So a little bit later, the next decade later, there were some other researchers who asked men and women about this experience. And lo and behold, actually asking men, you got lots of rich, detailed, deep, complex descriptions of their grief. And what they also found was that the reason why the women didn't think that their husbands were grieving quite as much was that the men were trying to actually protect their wives. They wanted her to have the space to grieve, or to take time off work, or to do what she needed to do. And they didn't want to burden her with this extra stuff about what they were feeling. So what they often did was, and we know that men often will talk about, they'll go to the shed, or they'll actually, as they're driving alone in the car to work and back, that might be when they, sob and cry and so on, which is not necessarily recommended from a safety perspective, but obviously just they feeling socially safe to do it because they're alone. Here where I am in Perth, we had a serial killer in the 1990s, and that person who did those was convicted in more recent years. And the father of one of the young women who was killed ended up writing a book about his experience, because he said when he went looking, he couldn't find many books written by men about their experience. And in that, he talks about how whenever he needed to, he would say to his wife, I'm going to the boat. And he would go to the boat and get in the boat, and that's when he would, cry or sob or moan or yell or whatever it is that he needed to do. But no one else knew that that's what was going on, and no one ever saw anything. And I think that's often what men might do. So yes, I think there are some gender differences, but obviously it's around what is socially acceptable or not. We also know there's been lots of times when if women react in a way that's too stoic or too practical, then they're considered to be grieving in the wrong way as well. So quite a famous case of that would be Lindy Chamberlain, who said a dingo took my baby, and in fact she was correct and wasn't lying. That people just thought she must be making up this story. Look at her, she's so stoic, she's not crying, she's not acting the way a real bereaved mother should be acting, therefore she's clearly guilty.
And what about for children?
So in terms of children, there's also a lot I can say about that. Children grieve quite differently. It's not just, children versus adults, because of course it depends on the age and developmental stage of the children as well. So very, very young children might not actually have the concept of death being permanent. So they might think you die, but then you come back the next day or 5 minutes later, just like in a cartoon. And children don't realize that we speak in code as adults. So if I said to you something like, I lost one of my parents last year, you don't think I've misplaced them. But a child might think, oh, okay, I'll look for that person. I'll look for granddad behind the couch. They don't realize that. So it's really important, I think, generally, but especially with children, to avoid euphemisms in how we talk about death and dying and dead, and use those D words, death, dying, dead, just as part of normal conversation, so that they develop that language of how to talk about these things. And we know that children can experience grief in a way that's probably a bit more physical. They're more likely to have tummy problems, or they might, if they had been toilet trained, then there might be some regression, or there might be, headaches and things like that. And then with teenagers, adolescence is a big transition in life, lots of anxiety and so on. And then you add in something else on top, another big stressor, like a death in the family or something. Yeah, you can find that some teenagers might test the boundaries of life and death and do a bit of risk-taking type behavior, and some might just get more anxious and might be more protective of everyone in their family and not want others out of their sight.
Fascinating talking about that language that you mentioned when talking to especially children of preschool age. And I think it's just a mechanism to protect them as adults, right? We use language like sleep or, they're away or they've gone, something like that. But it's so confusing to them because they don't understand the finality of death. So just using that language, introducing that to them at a young age is, as you mentioned, really, really important.
Yeah, I think 100%. And yeah, so I might be a bit of a weird mum myself, but that's what I do with my own kids from the time they were little. They're not so little now, they're 18 and 13. But yeah, I would try and talk to them. And you can just do that in normal conversation. You're going for a walk down the street and you come across a dead bug or a dead lizard, and you say, oh, look, a dead lizard. That lizard is dead. It must have died. Its body stopped working. It's not going to come back to life now. I bet its lizard family or bug family is feeling really sad now. And you can just do that in normal conversation.
Grief is inevitable. We're all going to lose loved ones. And so the earlier we can make that language, accessible and they have a good understanding of that, the easier it will be when the time comes.
Yeah, definitely.
And thinking specifically about bereaved mothers, which can be especially complex, maybe we could talk a little bit around the impact of losing a child specifically.
And I think it's changed so much. It used to be much more of a common experience, and now it's much less common. And also, we still don't talk about it even when it does happen. And so there's a lot of people, when they're pregnant, they'll say, well, I won't tell anybody until it's at least 12 weeks, which on the one hand is a great idea. But if something was to then go wrong, who's there to support you? So maybe it could have been better to let people know. Yeah, I think there's still a lot of this sort of secret business around talking about those, but particularly with perinatal losses. And I think that does make it obviously a lot more challenging. Yeah, so I think the death of a child or a perinatal death or a loss during pregnancy, it really can shatter our assumptions of how the world works. I thought that if I'm pregnant, I'll end up with a baby. That didn't happen. Or I thought good things happen to good people and bad things only happen to bad people, and this bad thing has just happened. Does that mean somehow I'm bad? I must have caused this. It must be something I did. It's my fault. And then there might even be people who maybe have meant well, maybe didn't, but also asked questions that maybe then reinforce this blameworthy aspect to it. What did you do? Is there something that you did? I told you shouldn't have gone for a run that day, or whatever it might be. And there's all of those kinds of things that we can end up really torturing ourselves over when they actually aren't the cause of what's happened and we're not to blame for it. But society likes to blame mums for everything, so why not for all of this as well? So yeah, there's a lot of challenges. I was involved in one study where we surveyed women in Australia who were perinatally bereaved, and we found that about 12 or 13% met the criteria for prolonged grief disorder. And that's higher than what you would expect generally in the community among bereaved people. So it certainly doesn't mean that all people who have a perinatal loss or the death of a child are going to end up with grief that's so intense and unremitting that we would call it a mental health condition. Because, as I said, grief is normal and natural, and it's how we respond to loss. But it might be that the likelihood is that it is a little bit more likely. Interestingly, in the study that I mentioned that I was involved in, we found that if that mother had other children already, that was more protective. Whether it's just simply because they already have other children, or is it just that they're having to get up, do things, they're not able to really fall apart so easily. We don't know that either.
And routine is quite helpful in coping with grief.
Yeah, routine's really good, and especially, I think, for all of us, but especially for children, if they experience a big loss in their life, for example, the death of a family member, and then if we can keep as much as we can the same. So can we still have, are they still in the same house or the same school? And sometimes we'll actually know they can't be, but can they at least still have the same bedtime routine or the same bedtime and the same, Saturdays was always pizza night, so we're still going to always have that as pizza night, or whatever it might be, so that not everything changes, but sometimes a lot of stuff does change.
Yeah, because as we were mentioning, children can grieve many things. So they can grieve changing circumstances. So it's sort of an additional layer of grief on top of that loved one that they've lost.
And that the concept, I guess, of re-grief, that as they develop emotionally and cognitively and all of that, they're able to reprocess the loss in a different way. So if they were 8 years old, for example, when something happened, as they get older, they'll process that again and differently at 10 and 12 and 15 and 25 and so on.
And if we're thinking about parents who have lost a child during that perinatal period but would like to fall pregnant again, or perhaps are pregnant again, what are some of those sort of considerations or strategies? Because then bonding with that fetus can be especially challenging because there's a lot of fear around attaching to a child when you've previously lost one. So, what are some of those coping strategies going into that next pregnancy? And I suppose especially if you don't have other children.
Yeah, I think it's important to know that there's no one way to do it in the first place. So even for people when they have a pregnancy and have a baby, there's always those people who, see the baby immediately and fall immediately in love and they're bonded forever. And then there are others who are like, oh, hello, stranger, let's get to know one another. And anything in between, and both of those are completely fine and normal. And so I think it's important for people to be gentle on themselves and to understand that, I might be a little bit more hesitant this time, but that makes sense. And it doesn't mean that I'm a monster and that I'm an awful parent or an awful mother or an awful person. But yeah, I'll just take it a little bit as I go, and, maybe I won't let myself fall in love straight away. I'll wait till it gets to a certain level of, certain progress of the pregnancy or whatever it is.
And then also being compassionate to your partner, so that you might process that differently and that bonding doesn't always occur at the same point in time. So being understanding of that and, just supporting wherever that parent is in their journey of that attachment relationship.
Yeah, and it's easy to jump on the partner or blame them and say, in grief as well, well, obviously my grief, I love them more because I'm this and you're not doing that. their experience of that person or that relationship with that person is different. And likewise, when it comes to a new baby, the expectations are different. How they might want to manage that challenge is different, and that's okay. We don't all have to do it exactly the same way on this, waiting for it to be a bit more certain, and the partner is, jumping headfirst into it. That's okay. We don't have to judge each other. We can just let each other be.
I love that. And thinking about sort of on the other hand, specifically with pregnancy, maybe you do find out that the child won't be able to survive long term, or, parents, anyone in our lives that is at the end of their life, and those feelings that can come before the death even occurs.
Yeah, so the concept of anticipatory grief, when you know, for example, a person is going to die, maybe they have a terminal illness, the idea is that you can grieve beforehand. But my understanding is that it was more about, I guess, doing the grief work or the work of grief before they die, and then you don't have to do so much after. And we now know from research that that concept of, well, I can just do it all before and then I'll be done and dusted, is really not well supported. What we know is that you can grieve for someone as they're dying, but you still grieve after as well. So I prefer to talk about pre-death grief and post-death grief rather than anticipatory grief, only because it has the potential for people to think that, okay, well, if I do it all now, I'll get it all out of the way and won't have to do it after.
I think also related to that is normalizing emotions that might seem incongruent to grieving. So, for instance, feeling relieved if a loved one suffered for a long period of time, and you might feel a lot of guilt around having emotions that, society doesn't perceive as normal responses.
Yeah, absolutely. And, people I've spoken to who have been caring for their spouse for many, many years have said, I'm doing this, I'm committed to doing this, but I've also got my plan for as soon as this person, as soon as my wife dies, I've already got the caravan, I'm ready to go, I've got my plan, I'm going around Australia, I'm going to put some time and effort into me and my life in a way that I haven't been able to do for 9 years. And so I think there is absolutely those kinds of experiences, and it is completely fine to have a whole bunch of emotions and feelings, but we do judge ourselves, and unfortunately sometimes other people judge us as well, because, maybe you're at the funeral or just after the funeral and someone tells a funny joke and you laugh at the joke and you think, oh, how dare I laugh today? Or what if someone see me laugh? Oh my goodness, I'm not allowed to do this. I'm a terrible person. And actually, no, you're just a person.
Yeah, I think it's the concept of closure, which seemed to be really common, which is just, it's not true, right? You're just constantly managing it in different ways throughout the lifespan. So moving away from that understanding of things. And I think it's tempting if, you have a new partner, a new relationship, for instance, if a husband has died and you get remarried, for friends and family to think, well, that's sort of sorted out. They got their second happily ever after, but they're still grieving throughout that new relationship as well, just, in a different way, or perhaps more privately because it's been a long period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've banished those kinds of words from my vocabulary. So when I'm talking about grief, I don't talk about closure or letting go or moving on or recovery or, I don't know, all of those kinds of things. I always talk about grief is something that, we adapt to and accommodate into our lives. And so that's the language that I would use for that exact reason. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier saying sort of the work of grief, and that made me think of, we sort of hear about 5 stages of grief and sort of moving through a process. What does the recent research tell us about that? Is this 5 stages the way that it works, or what is the work of grief?
So, I also don't talk about the stages of grief either. When something's on TV and you yell at the TV about something, this is what I yell about, because almost every TV show and movie or whatever will talk about the stages of grief, and then I'm yelling at the TV about that. It's changed a little bit in the last few years. There's been some excellent TV shows that really have done a great job with grief. So Afterlife or This Is Us or Fleabag, all kinds of things like that. But yeah, it used to be, very irritating. So the idea about there being stages of grief, or the most well-known version is from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was talking about people who were dying, and she said that they experienced various things, but it became interpreted in this way that you have to first there's denial, then anger, then bargaining, then depression, and then acceptance. And it became so well known that every textbook would say this is the experience. I think it's been a hugely terrible idea in that there really isn't any evidence for it. In fact, there's all the evidence is kind of in the opposite way.
I think for me, one of the biggest takeaways from this conversation is just that we need to do better about talking to each other and not being afraid to talk about death and dying and loss and grief. But Lauren, for our listeners, what would be a final takeaway that you would like to share about this topic?
Well, I love what you just said. I 100% agree with that. Really, really important for us to talk about it because it is something we will all experience in many, many ways for many, many reasons throughout our lives. We need to know how to support ourselves. We need to know how to support people around us. So we absolutely should be talking about this a lot more so that not just if, but when it happens to us, we've got that language. Kids have that language to talk about the concepts, to talk about how they're feeling. And we can hopefully be a lot more connected and compassionate and caring to others in the wake of loss.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting and we learned a lot from that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.